the first video where you kind of changed the format was doing the review of the Beatles Get Back.
Exactly.
And then
yeah,
you get a lot of views then, and you were thinking, oh, okay.
Yeah, and you know what? It's interesting, Larry. That video was the game changer. I didn't know it at the time. I think I did. I started this channel. Well, I think I joined October 7th, but my first video was out October 28th. So I consider that the day I started.
Yeah.
And come November, I had, of course, seen Get Back. I was really excited to see that because you're talking to a guy at 15 years old. I went to go see Let It Be in the theater.
I remember. I did that
3 times a day,
it was
every day. Though. Yeah, it was. But, I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
I was just heavily getting into their lore and what was going on. I knew that, of course, we had heard that the Beatles had broken up, and by the time that hit the theaters, that was part of the story and everything. But I lived in the theater while that movie was going. Same thing, I could say the same thing about Pink Floyd. I think they called it Pink Floyd Live. Now it's known Live at Vesuvius. Is that it? It's a DVD that's out, and it's them in an old Roman amphitheater.
Yep.
And interspersed with cuts of them actually in Abbey Road working on Dark Side of the Moon. So, these are the kinds of things that I grew up with. This is how this and buying Rolling Dumb magazine. And
I used to buy it 2 years ago.
Oh, did you pour? This is a question for you. Did you pour over the John Lennon interview almost like biblical scripture?
Oh, of course.
I did.
Yeah.
And I took it so seriously.
And I also took all of the reviews to heart, right? So with certain albums, they would say they sucked. It's like, okay, they suck. And
like Ram,
later you realize, oh, they didn't suck.
Yeah, like Ram. Ram by Paul McCartney. First of all, in my opinion, Ram is his best album.
I agree.
Bar none.
Yep.
And at the time, the guy who was going to write that up for Rolling Stone interview, he gave it a favorable review.
Yep.
And Jann, Wenner boy, put the squelch on that because Jann Wenner was buddies with John Lennon. But now when I was reading that Rolling Stone interview for the first time, that was the complete story as I knew it. And as the years unfolded, and I found out that there are people in rock and roll who are part of an almost elite system that make all of the freaking decisions. And Jann Wenner's one of those people, in my humble opinion. Now, he may be the nicest guy once you get to know him. I don't know. But alls I know is his sticky little fingers have been in, especially in an East Coast kind of power grab later. His leanings was West Coast, but think about who his best friends are. Yeah. Think about who he hangs out with. Bono, who he calls B. Can you believe that? Me and B.
Maybe someday I can call you M.
My wife does that occasionally, and I know I'm in trouble. Because it's usually M, I, C. It's her way of counting to 10. But
even with that, it's like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? With these certain bands that the Guess Who, Steppenwolf, Grand Funk, still not in it. Three Dog Night, the biggest bands from the early 70s, right?
Right. And it's, the thing is, it's interesting. I haven't talked too much about this. I think I brought this up in one of my videos. But don't you almost get that McCartney is almost playing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame these days? I mean, he's playing nicey nice. And if there is I know in my heart of hearts, McCartney can't stand the man. He can't. He can't. There's way too much damage that man did to McCartney. Not only he cost that man money. Ram should have been a #1 to the bullet album, and only to figure out, that album and the McCartney album, by the way, around the early 90s is when I remember it kind of starting to turn around for these albums, as far as some audio files we're giving them a listen to, especially Ram. And that it was right around that time that the McCartney album was starting to be known as the first lo-fi album, and with a lot of the alternative acts in the 90s doing their version of lo-fi, all of a sudden he was in the charm for the first time in decades. And but him inducting so and so, showing up for this, playing nicey nice, I'm hoping. Anyway, I'm hoping what he's going to get out of it is a third nomination, which he more than deserves, for his work with Wings.
Absolutely.
Because
they were a band.
Right. And they were a separate entity from what we see him doing as a solo artist. Denny Lane, a lot of people don't know this. He wrote the most of the lyrics and most of the melody to Mull of Kintyre. McCartney later bought him out, right? And so, but that whole "long have I traveled," that's all Denny Lane, baby.
Wow.
All right. Yeah, the Mull of Kintyre refrain, Mull of Kin, that's McCartney, right? And that's McCartney at his best, is when he finds a really great writer. And he can put that McCartney charm and spin on a song, because as wonderful as that verse is by Lane, it's the refrain that we keep hearing. Now, it wasn't a big hit here in the Americas.
It was here in Canada.
Not in the United States.
Yeah, I know.
As a matter of fact, I think it was a B-side. And it drove me insane, because, anything came out McCartney, I had it. I got my greedy little hands on it. And, and all of a sudden, it just, we didn't get that version. And it was huge in England. For years, it was the #1 single, outselling the Beatles, outselling Wings, everything, that had come before. So, but I think they deserve it. I really do.
Yeah. Even like Red Rose Speedway is another album. It's not his best album, but back in the day, because of Rolling Stone and these other magazines, it's like, oh, it's bad. So I never even properly ever listened to it until the archive collection came out. I bought the double CD, and it's like, oh my God, this is actually great. And I ended up buying the box set. So it's for all those years, listening to lyrics.
Well, back in the day, I loved the second Wings, the first album came out. I bought it hook, line, and sinker, but I was a Beatles fan. And I was also, a McCartney fan. And so I thought they were all great albums when they came out. And then, of course, as the years unfolded, a couple of the albums, you have to choose which are the weakest of them all, and all of that. And Red Rose Speedway is one of those albums that, to me, is like 2/3 great. And what the hell was he thinking about Loop the Indian and that little suite in there? Because it messes
myself.
Okay. Now, and see, a lot of McCartney fans do love that. And they, just like they like a lot of his doodlings on McCartney too. And those doodlings, by the way, were always in the Beatles recordings.
Yeah.
He used a term back in the day. I haven't heard him say this or use this term in recent interviews, but he used to say back in the 70s and 80s, I love topping and tailing an album. Topping and tailing. And he was talking specifically in the interview that I'm thinking of right now about Tug of War. And if you've ever listened to that, one of his very best albums, by the way, lots of topping and tailing, a lot of, what is that one line? Dun, 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 dun. It's just a little snippet in between. And he would do that. He really kind of polished that whole approach with side 2 of Abbey Road. But even before Abbey Road, there was a lot of little topping and tailing. And that's what he brings into a writership. I think that's what Lennon needed. You know, Lennon would later go, well, he was messing up my songs, and boy, I really hate the recording of this one and that one. Yeah. But really?
I've always felt that John Lennon was jealous of Paul, like more than, you know, I'm sure Paul was maybe a little jealous of John too for lyrics or whatever. But I think John was jealous because it was so easy for Paul to do a melody or write a medley, I mean.
Well, John would be the first one to tell you, I'm just a jealous guy.
Yeah.
And you know what? Jealousy was part of this is why I love John Lennon.
Yeah.
John Lennon could be wrong in the moment and not give a damn. You know, John Lennon, this is how I'm feeling in the moment. This is how I do. John Lennon got his feelings hurt. Isn't that wonderful? You never quite know with Paul. Yeah. Paul's always the chipper, and he's a wink. He's got a wink. I've recognized in interviews. And when that wink goes, it says miles, because all of a sudden interviewers shut down, change direction, and whatever. He can do it in a wink. John Lennon wasn't that. His heart was right here, man.
Yeah.
All the time. And he was a genius. Mm-hmm. And McCartney had a jealousy that he dealt with, especially right after John died.
Yeah.
You know, you could hear it in interviews. He'd go,
I was doing the experimental music. Like,
right. Yeah. He had to bring that out. The books.
Yeah.
Right. But he would even say things like, what? You know, George was just sitting around holding a plectrum.
Yeah.
You know, he really, because they really did kind of make Lennon a saint, and that's understandable under the conditions of how he died, what was going around that and everything. And on top of that, he was every bit Paul McCartney's equal in every sense of the word, right? And so, yes. And when McCartney finally passes off this mortal coil, a similar thing will happen with him, I'm sure. But living, still quite young Beatles had to deal with that problem, that all of a sudden it was like John Lennon's best stuff. Matter of fact, I even read an article where they tried to explain how the very best stuff on Sgt. Pepper's was actually John Lennon's stuff. And the first thing I felt was like, well, almost what stuff? I mean, he's got like, 4 songs? He's got a couple on the first side, couple on the second side. Yeah. And of course, Strawberry Fields got waylaid. That should have been on there. But then again, Penny Lane would have been on there if that had been on there. Yeah. That's a McCartney album for the most part. And John Lennon's stuff in there, without it, it would never have been the classic album it was. Yep. Lennon's stuff is so important. It adds a dimension. And then my favorite cut on the album is not by either one of them. It's George Harrison, Within You, Without You.
Yeah.
I can put that on to this day and meditate. And it is so true. Every word about it and everything. A young man still in his relatively early 20s, and such wisdom from a song, and it just broke up the album beautifully. Yeah. And just when you thought you were getting too serious, Paul comes in, Chipper Dipper Dale, you know.
Yeah.
But no, this whole kind of thing about who was better, Paul, John, Paul. You know, well, I'm a Lennon fan, I'm a McCartney fan. Listen, while those two men were still alive, because you can only compare them while they were still cohabitating the earth, they were equals in every freaking sense of the word, yet as different as two sides of the same coin.
And wait until we talk about this.
Yes. Canada's very best band and one of the world's best bands. And
Glenn Galloway from the Basement, are you watching?
No. Oh, man, I love this
very
band.
Talented. Yeah.
Oh, man. Do you remember when they first came out?
Yeah.
You know, 1976,
I remember
man.
Hearing about this, right? 3:47 Eastern Standard Time. I bought the album. You know, I put it on. As soon as the vocals started, I knew, right? But it was still great.
Right. Yeah. The first thing I heard, well, first of all, the way I heard it was the disc jockeys, KFRC, all of those local AM stations, and then some of the FM stations. The disc jockeys would always start before they would play the song, or as it would fade in, they would talk about them possibly being the Beatles. So ears pricked up immediately. Yeah. So guilty on all charges, Your Honor. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I got called into it just like pretty much everybody else did. And then I heard that album, and I had fun with it for about a day and a half thinking, could it be? Yeah. Would it be? Yeah. Especially when you hear Sub Rosa Subway. Now that did sound close to the Beatles. Man, it sounded like it could have come off the latest Wings album, even, and so I thought, And then Dr. Marvello. Yeah. That could be George right there. I'm hearing almost that George, type of feel to it. But then I settled down and I knew they weren't the Beatles. I mean, a good listen, and they're not the Beatles. That was still the teeny bopper in me wanting to believe and hoping, But once I settled down and I just listened to the band, I mean, what about California Jam? Goodbye, Mythical Malibu. Yeah. The San Andreas Misfortune will claim the lives of sons and wives. The headlines will fill page after page. Yeah. Where do you get lyrics like that these days? It's about the Great Quake and all of that. And you could swear you're listening to the Beach Boys the whole damn time. It's almost like a cross between the Beach Boys and, back in the USSR. And no, Mike Love, you didn't co-write Back in the USSR. Get off your high horse.